Welcome back to TMH English News, and I'm Delita Dawalko. Tigray armed forces capture more territories to the east and south of Kambolcha. A new wave of detentions of ethnic Tigrayans has begun as Tigray forces make advances into the city. Ethiopia tried to limit rare UN report on Tigray war abuses. The armed forces of Tigray capture more territories to the east and south of Kambolcha, and military command of the Tigray armed forces said its forces have taken control of Garba, Bati, and Barqa yesterday and are moving towards Mile. And the military command also said that its forces that have moved southwards also took control of Babru and are heading into the direction of Kimse. The people of those areas have welcomed the Tigray armed forces with joy and a provision of food, water, and the command said that adding the people of Desse and Kambolcha have started to go about their normal daily lives. Tigrayan forces captured 2 towns, raised fear of Ethiopian capital, and the weekend seizure of 2 key towns on the main road to Addis Ababa has alarmed Ethiopian leaders who fear that the rapid advances of the Tigray armed forces may soon threaten the capital itself. As fears mounted of the continued push to Addis Ababa, 380 kilometers further south, member of Central Command of the Tigray Armed Forces, Getachew Reda, denied the organizations had designs on the capital and claimed the offensive aimed only to break the government siege on the Tigray region, which has been imposed by Ahmed since the year 2019. The offensive by the Tigray Armed Forces was the most decisive yet in a year-long conflict with Ethiopian government forces and led the country's Prime Minister Abi to call for the loyalists to double efforts to defend the seat of power. Use any type of weapons to block the destructive path, to overturn it and bury it, he said. The Tigray forces also told AP that they were poised to physically link up with another armed group, the Oromo Liberation Army, with which they struck alliance earlier this year. Prime Minister Abi says non-Ethiopian nationals joined Tigray forces in Wello. Prime Minister Ahmed said that the non-Ethiopian nationals have joined Tigray armed forces in the war in the Wello front. Briefing senior government officials on the current affairs, Abi claimed black and white nationals of the non-Ethiopian descent have participated in the war and made sacrifices with the Tigrayan forces. Member of Central Command of Tigray Armed Forces, Getachew Reda, said the latest claim of Abi's is positive proof that he's clinically insane. He also added, however, it's insanity with method. Read in conjunction with his spiritual guru, Daniel Kabrat, incendiary remarks about Walloye's complicity with the Tigray armed forces in bringing about defeat in the Wello front. Abi is insinuating that expat terrorists, probably Muslims, took part in the fight, and Getachew Reda said, according to Abi, is blaming Wello and not the Tigray armed forces. Getachew Reda also said Abi will blame the whole Ethiopian population for not being stupid enough to commit to collective suicide for the sake of his delusional adventures. He needs to be stopped before he fully unleashes a 21st century version of state of nature, and very soon, Getachew Reda wrote on his Twitter. A new wave of detentions of ethnic Tigrayans has begun as Tigray forces make their advances. A new roundup of Tigrayans was seen in the capital as soon as Monday, and government spokesperson Legasa Tulu Tigray told Tigray, who believe the government is now weakening and Tigray forces are coming, should be extremely careful. Some even went to nightclubs to celebrate, and the government is taking actions against those, he said. Abiy Ahmed said Sunday that the federal troops are fighting 4 fronts against Tigray forces, but admitted to weakness and unpreparedness on the part of his own government. Amid calls on social media for attacks against ethnic Tigrayans, Abiy Ahmed said everybody should closely follow those who work for the enemy and live amongst the people. In a related development, a newly established joint task force in the city of Addis Ababa announced that it has intensified taking strident legal measures against who is dubbed our supporters and are not nostalgic of the TPLF. In a statement issued via state media, the Joint Task Force compromises of the National Security and intelligence services, federal and Addis Ababa police, as well as the Oromia police, have announced that it has taken decisive legal actions against those threatening the peace and security of the city. It cautioned residents of the city that they should check the identities of those tenants who rent those houses in groups, individuals or groups who are supporters and are extremely nostalgic of the TPLF and are meeting in conspicuous places. The task also said it has received information that the terrorist group and its supporters were planning to use counterfeit uniforms of security forces to confuse the public and carry out their criminal activities as well. Spokeswoman of the Office of Ethiopia's Prime Minister says her government is not responsible for ensuring that assistance reaches famine-stricken people of Tigray. In an interview with NPR News, Bilena Siyom said her government believes that aid is being diverted to the Tigray armed forces. NPR News challenged the spokeswoman why the Ethiopian government does not live up to its responsibility of helping innocent civilians in need, and even the alleged diversion of aid makes the war harder, as it usually is the case in the areas of this conflict. She responded by saying the onus of responsibility of ensuring the assistance reaches those of vulnerable communities is on those that claim to be administrating their own region. The spokeswoman denied that the trucks can't get through Ethiopia's forces, and the UN says hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians are living in famine conditions in Tigray, and that some are already dying of hunger. 1 year on Ethiopia's Tigray conflict is said to be no closer to any political solution. A blog post by Michelle Gavin says 12 months in, and the conflict is widening, the human toll is devastating, and the prospects of peace more remote than ever. The future of the Ethiopian state is so uncertain that the International Monetary Fund declined to release a forecast for the country in the latest World Economic Outlook. According to the commentary, no credible observers believe there can be a lasting military solution to the multiple conflicts tearing apart the Ethiopian state, and yet vast obstacles stand in the way of any political solutions. Prime Minister Abi Ahmed's October offensive is foundering with Tigrayan forces capturing new territories further south, while their allies in the Oromo Liberation Army have made gains in their offensive as well. Meanwhile, federal forces continue to strangle the Tigray region, obstructing humanitarian access and waging a sustained aerial bombardment campaign. The problem is now compounded by total of absence of trust and credibility. Abi and his allies complain of shadowing international conspiracies aimed at restoring Tigrayan dominance, which the commentary dubbed is a convenient way to dismiss international dismay at the country's unraveling. At the same time, the Prime Minister's misrepresentation and untruths have eroded his credibility as a serious negotiating partner and called into question his capacity to rein in the forces unleashed in his campaign, be they Eritrean troops or the Amhara militia. The only strong card in the weak hand of diplomats try to dose the flames in Ethiopia is the increasing likelihood that Ethiopian leaders stay current course and the country is headed for collapse, said in this commentary. The commentary also advised that this would be the peacemakers will need to enlist unconventional partners and find trusted morale authorities to help patch together their efforts, even if they prepare for the scenarios in which overt fractures in Abi's coalition further complicate the field. In Ethiopia's war on Tigray, Eritrea's army exacted deadly vengeance on his old foes and Eritrean refugees. The arrival of the Eritrean troops marked the beginning of a month-long ordeal for thousands of Eritrean refugees, as said by Reuters. And Reuters also spoke to more than 60 refugees, and these interviews revealed the role of the Eritrean Army Division and commander who led the campaign to force the refugees back into Eritrea, and Eritrean soldiers then destroyed the camps thereafter. The refugees told of a systematic military operation at a border town, and Eritrea soldiers set up a COVID-19 quarantine center staffed by the Eritrean doctors, soldiers that bust thousands of refugees into Eritrea. Some went at gunpoint, others said they went voluntarily, swapping the perils of Tigray for uncertainties of their homeland. The refugees also told for the first time how once in Eritrea, some of their numbers were jailed or forced into military service. Within days, the truckloads of soldiers from the 35th Division of the Eritrean Army arrived at the two refugee camps in Hitsat and Shimbela, and the soldiers had lists of names as well. In Hitsat, soldiers called refugees to leaders to a meeting, and the 20 or more who complied were detained and said more than dozens of witnesses, one demonstrating how the men's elbows were pinned behind their backs. They were held for 2 days at a church building in a camp, then loaded onto trucks by Eritrean soldiers and driven away, and the witnesses said Reuters has confirmed that names of 17 of men and their families have not heard from them since as well. Similar scenes played out in Shimeba, about 15 kilometers from the Eritrean border. They were looking for members of the opposition, and they had a list of names. The Eritrean soldiers detained around 40 people, and some of them were women, said the refugee leader. Ethiopia is said to try to limit rare UN report on Tigray war abuses. Member of Central Command of Tigray Armed Forces, Getachew Reda, on his part said whatever the joint investigation findings, the report is fraught with a number of problems. The findings of the only human rights investigations allowed in Ethiopia's blockade in Tigray's region will be released on Wednesday, a year after the war began. But when people of knowledge of the probe said it has been limited by authorities who recently expelled a UN staffer helping to lead it. The joint investigation by the UN Human Rights Office and the government-created Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, or the EHRC, is rare collaboration that immediately raised concerns among the Tigrayans and the human rights groups and other observers, and the impartiality of the government influence. Member of Central Command of the Tigray Armed Forces, Getachew, said what the joint investigation findings in the report is fraught with a number of problems. First, the investigation didn't cover all of the heinous crime spots in Tigray, and second, the EHRS as a partner in the investigation is an affront to the notion of impartiality, he wrote on his Twitter account. Getachew Reda in a tweet also noted that the EHRC simply read verbatim Abi's talking points, adding whatever is its substance. The methodology was so flawed it only soiled the reputations of Office for the Higher Commissioner of the Human Rights, which tried its best to remain true to its ideals. In response to the question from the Associated Press, the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva said it would have been able to enter Tigray without the partnership with Rights Commission, although past joint investigations occurred in Afghanistan and Uganda, and the UN said the current one is unique in terms of magnitude as well as context. Ethiopia has declared a nationwide state of emergency as the Tigray Armed Forces make advances. Ethiopia's Justice Minister Gideon Timothimos today announced the declaration of a nationwide state of emergency by the cabinet, and Ethiopia's government has declared a nation state of emergency as the country's year-long war escalates quickly with Tigrayan forces making huge advances, and as the state of emergency takes effective immediately, will last for about 6 months. The government can impose a curfew, disrupt transport services, and travel and detain indefinitely anyone suspected of having links with a terrorist group. Local administration in some areas could be disbanded, and military leadership could be installed as well. According to the declarations, such actions would be implemented by law, and Ethiopian lawmakers are expected to convene on the matter within 48 hours. The declaration was the clearest sign of alarm yet from the government of Abiy Ahmed, who a year ago this week allowed soldiers from the neighboring country to invade the Tigray region and pursue the Tigray forces alongside Ethiopian troops. That wraps up our news for today. Thank you for tuning in.